This skin was burned off some of the people and was hanging from their hands and from their chins. Okay, listen to that for a second. That's a direct historical eyewitness account. It isn't from a soldier or a general. It's from a little girl who was literally just 5 years old in Hiroshima when the atomic bomb fell. In this explainer, we're diving into one of history's absolute most complex events. When we study history, especially huge global events like this, it's super easy to get totally lost in the dates, the stats, and the strategies. But before we get into the political arguments, we really have to start right here with the visceral human reality of August 1945. Take a look at these two photos. On the left, you've got a survivor of the blast in Hiroshima bearing the horrific physical scars of the weapon. And on the right, that's the unimaginable, sweeping scale of death in the rubble of a street in Nagasaki. As history students, it's our job to look at these harsh realities and ask some incredibly difficult questions. We've got to ground ourselves in the fact that decisions made in comfortable rooms thousands of miles away resulted in the exact scenes you're looking at right now. And that brings us to the core question of this whole explainer. Was it justified? Dropping the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki is still one of the most agonizing, hotly debated moral and military decisions in all of human history. Now listen, we aren't here to take a side today. Not at all. Instead, we're going to put on our historian hats. We're going to objectively look at the primary sources, the evidence, and the strongest arguments from both sides of this massive debate. So here's our roadmap. First up, the ultimate historical question. Then we'll look at the case for dropping it, followed by retaliation and POWs. After that, we'll flip to the case against dropping it, look into whether they were already defeated, and finally, the verdict is yours. All right, let's jump straight into Section 1, the ultimate historical question, a decision that changed the world. Let's set the stage and look at the immense pressure Allied leaders were under in the summer of 1945. Moving right along to Section 2, the case for dropping it, the argument of necessity. We're going to start with the primary defense for the bombing. Basically, why did leaders like U.S. President Harry Truman feel they absolutely had to use this terrible weapon? 5 million. That is a massively terrifying number. According to Henry Stimson, he was the American Secretary for War back in 1945, there was absolutely no sign of the Japanese weakening their determination to fight. The total strength of the Japanese army? Roughly 5 million men. The Allies were staring down the barrel of a full-scale land invasion of the Japanese home islands, and the American reports from that time were clear. The Japanese were making defense their absolute top priority, mining beaches and heavily fortifying the hillsides. And then add this number to the mix, 5,000. That was the estimated number of Japanese suicide aircraft just waiting to strike Allied forces. Stimson and the Allied command genuinely believed they were dealing with a military force ready to fight to the absolute death. In fact, President Truman's own grandson later pointed out that Truman felt he simply had to use the bomb to stop the war and save both American and Japanese lives. Why? Because intercepted reports showed Japanese forces massing right where the Allies were planning to land. But there's another really fascinating and maybe a bit more cynical angle to this. $2 billion. That was the staggering cost of the Manhattan Project, the top-secret program that actually built the bomb. According to a booklet from the Campaign for Nuclear Disarmament, that huge financial investment made it incredibly tough for politicians to justify not using it. Think about it. Once you spend $2 billion building a war-ending superweapon, the political pressure to actually use the thing is just massive. All right, Section 3, retaliation and POWs, the forgotten captives. When you look at the primary sources, the contrast in how prisoners were treated is staggering. Allied prisoners captured by the Japanese faced a 25% death rate in captivity. To put that into perspective, the death rate for prisoners taken by the Germans and Italians in Europe was around 5%. British survivors of Japanese prison camps described living under the constant threat of disease, brutal beatings, and starvation. The punishments were literally barbaric. We're talking about prisoners being buried alive or forced to dig their own graves. Former Prime Minister of Singapore, Lee Kuan Yew, actually argued the atom bombs were necessary purely because of this viciousness. He stated that without the bombs, hundreds of thousands more would have died. Which brings us to this chilling historical detail. It was reported that the very second a land invasion of Japan began, all Allied prisoners of war were to be executed immediately. Over 200,000 Allied soldiers, marked for death. For many historians and leaders who defend the decision to drop the bomb, this fact right here is absolute proof that the atomic weapons saved hundreds of thousands of captive lives that would have been slaughtered on day one of an invasion. Now, as good historians, we have to look at the counter-arguments. Welcome to Section 4, the case against dropping it.
The human cost and morality. Let's pivot and dig into the absolute strongest arguments against the bombing, focusing on the unprecedented human devastation and the moral outcry that followed.
You see, what made the atomic bomb completely different from literally any weapon used before wasn't just the initial blast, it was the radiation. A British journalist who made it to Hiroshima 30 days after the bombing called it an atomic plague. People who seemed completely uninjured by the explosion were suddenly dying, mysteriously and horribly, weeks later. Japanese eyewitnesses documented terrifying symptoms: vomiting blood, purple spots showing up on the skin, bleeding from the mouth, hair falling out in clumps. This delayed, agonizing death sentence completely changed the moral calculus of the weapon. And the moral backlash? It was immediate, even back home in the United States. In 1946, a report by the Federal Council of Churches, representing American Christians, stated they were deeply penitent for the irresponsible use of the bomb. They actually called the surprise bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, quote, morally indefensible. This goes to show that the idea of total unanimous American support for the bombings is kind of a historical myth. There was deep, immediate ethical conflict right from the start. Which sets up a really fascinating what-if scenario. Back in June 1945, before any cities were targeted, American atomic scientists actually pitched an alternative plan to their government. They suggested safely demonstrating the bomb in a desert or on a barren island. The idea was to let Japanese leaders see the earth-shattering power of this thing from a safe distance and then ask for their surrender, completely avoiding civilian casualties. But obviously, that alternative was rejected. Why? Well, Secretary of War Henry Stimson laid it out pretty bluntly. The military brass just didn't believe a harmless demonstration would actually convince a determined Japan to give up. Plus, they were terrified of a public failure. I mean, what if they invited the Japanese high command to watch and the test bomb was a dud? That would embolden the enemy, not defeat them. And practically speaking, as Stimson pointed out, they literally had no bombs to waste. They only had 2 ready to go. That brings us to Section 5. Were they already defeated? The military debate. This is honestly one of the most fiercely debated questions among military historians. Did the bomb actually end the war, or was Japan already on the verge of surrendering anyway? Look at these 2 totally conflicting views of the military reality. On the left, you've got Fleet Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, stating flat out that the Japanese had already sued for peace and that the atomic bomb played no decisive part militarily. Even Paul Nitz, a major American politician at the time, thought Japan would have surrendered without the bomb and without an invasion. But then, look on the right. Historian Richard B. Frank points to intercepted Japanese Imperial Army messages. Those intercepts prove Japan was actively planning Ketsugo, or Operation Decisive, a literal Armageddon battle in their homeland designed to cause such massive casualties that the Americans would negotiate rather than conquer them. And even when you look inside the Japanese high command, it's complicated. In a 1963 interview, the secretary to the Japanese war minister admitted that, sure, they thought they could defeat the first American landing. But a second or third attack? That would have completely wiped out their food supply and weapons. His final thought on it? The Americans could have won without using the atomic bombs. Essentially, they were already being starved out of their ability to wage war. Finally, we arrive at Section 6. The verdict is yours. Weighing history. We've looked at the terrifying reality of the weapon, the desperation of the military strategy, and the heavy moral questions. Now it's time to weigh the history. These numbers right here represent the brutal, terrible mathematics of war that leaders felt forced to calculate. Winston Churchill passionately defended the bomb, saying he was surprised people would rather sacrifice an estimated 1 million American lives and 250,000 British lives in a land invasion rather than just drop the bomb. So you have the lives estimated to be saved on the invasion beaches weighed directly against the hundreds of thousands of men, women, and children who suffered and died in the atomic blasts. It is an incredibly horrific scale to try and balance. And you know what? The questions just keep getting harder. The campaign for nuclear disarmament raises a deeply unsettling point from our sources. Because the Manhattan Project actually developed 2 different types of atomic bombs, one uranium, one plutonium. There's an argument that dropping that second bomb on Nagasaki was just a cruel experiment to test the second type. Was destroying a second entire city an act of absolute military necessity? Or was it a tragic, entirely unnecessary scientific test? I want to leave you with this incredibly powerful thought from Leo Szilard. He was one of the scientists who actually worked on the atomic bomb. And he asks a chilling, hypothetical question. Suppose Germany had developed the bomb first. Suppose Germany dropped 2 atomic bombs on American cities, like Rochester and Buffalo, to win the war. Szilard asks, Can anyone doubt that we would have defined dropping those bombs on cities as a war crime and hanged the Germans at Nuremberg? It places us directly in the judge's seat. As history students looking at all this evidence, the military necessities, the saved POWs, the melted skin, the radiation plague, how do you rule on this profound moment in human history? The verdict, based on the evidence we've explored today, is now yours to debate.